맞아주십시오.
Thank you very much. Yes, yeah. Thank you very much. I really feel honored to be invited here. And though I'm not a specialist in the field of Korean War, at the same time I was told that there were no translation from Chinese to Korean, so I have to speak in English, though the English is not my native language. And I prepared this paper in a very short time, and I have to write it in Chinese, so I didn't prepare an English text. I'm so sorry for this. So if I'm not so clear in the presentation, just let me know. I try to clarify what I mean, so sorry for this. So I try to introduce something from Chinese perspective. Partly because when we talk about the peace as a process, you have to involve different perspectives into that process. So without different perspectives, it's difficult to have a peace process. It's just like a peace negotiation. Now we are discussing about the future. So that's why, of course, it's difficult to have the scholars from northern side of Korea. But at least I try to introduce something from Chinese perspective. Let me start it from the names of the war, the naming, the politics of naming. We know that now it's become normal. The people use the term of Korean War to name this period, that from 1950 to the 1953, that's the war. However, we know that in North Korea, that war was named as Liberation War, the war for the liberation of homeland, right? So, 国解放战争. And sometimes as I know, maybe here, sometimes we call that the Korean War and the incident of June 25th. In China, it's a totally different term. It's a war of resisting American invasion and helping Korea. 抗美援朝 war. So it's a totally different term and naming. The different names or the politics of naming reveal the different perspectives. So this is a very different, because China's involvement in the war started from October. At that time, American army already landed in Linchuan and also approached to the river of Yalu River. So that's why China claimed the war and sent troops into Korea for protect China and helping North Korea. That's why the naming. That was the history. However, if you look at what happened now, more than 10 years ago, I visited the War Museum here. And 2 weeks ago, oh no, it's 2 or 3 weeks ago, the first time for me as a tourist to visit North Korea, I visit the newly opened the museum of the war of liberation of homeland. I recall what I saw here and what I saw there to compare the different narrations. It's a hugely difference. The same story, different narrations. And obviously, I couldn't help myself to make reference to what I learned from when I was a child. What I was taught about the Korean War is a third version. So at least not mention American version, Chinese version, North Korea, South Korea, different narrations about the war. So in that sense, the division, separation is not only the political reality, it is a reality in our memory. It was created a new political intention and the reality. So that I think is very important. That's different memories about the war, different narrations about the war was so important. Sometimes I feel people, when I read the exhibition or the narration of the War Museum here, I found what missed was the period that from the end of World War II, 1945, to what happened before the war began. That period was not emphasized. And what happened there in that side, they didn't talk about who shot the first bullet. So different people, you found that hide some stories, highlight some stories that we need to put it together. But before that, nobody can presume that we are objective. We are the God. We can see everything. But what the way for me is that to retrieve the internal perspective to put it on the table for the further open discussion. That I think is very important. And very interesting, I think interesting enough, in the last 2 decades in China, the historical studies about the Korean War has been the hot topic. It's very important. It's one of the fields published so many documents and research books. Mainly because release of the Soviet Union archive. And after the Chinese reform, open door policy, the Chinese scholars was able to check some archives from American side too. And a lot of the memoirs in China were published. So that's why with these new materials and documents, historians try to reconstruct the map of the war. So, but it's not necessarily mean that when you have the archive, more materials, not necessarily mean that you are closer to the truth. Not necessarily. I give you the example. So there was basically now most of the scholarship in China about the Korean War try to put it into the framework of so-called the Cold War history, right? That's as a starting point of the Cold War in East Asia. That's basically the tendency. So, but there was different views on the China's involvement in the war. However, these different views, I think I can summarize that as a methodological nationalism. Means some people criticize that war, criticize China's involvement, because they claim that according to the newly released the Soviet archive, they claim that Mao was cheated by Stalin and Chen Chang, and because they didn't told him about the whole story before the war. So that's the same time. So that's why the huge, massive casualties China had sacrificed. Some other people argue that no, it was not the case, because only after the war in 1950 to 1953, that was the first war after the establishment of the PRC. So only, we know that the war happened, the broke out, is only 8 months after the establishment of PRC. So that was the unexpected involvements. So only after the war that China and the North side claimed that we defeat America in Korea. So in that sense, China established the full sovereignty in the global scale. So before that, it expelled the KMT from mainland China to Taiwan. That's resumed the sovereignty within the country. But after the war, China established itself as a sovereign country, respected by the whole international community, though China had never been accepted as a formal member of UN before the 1972. So that was the another story. But both arguments and analysis were based on the framework, what I call the methodological nationalism, meaning that the national interests as the only standards to evaluate the role of China in the war. So this is the more cool scientific the views. It's not only that I think that the most of the scholars in the field were historians in international relations. So that was not which means that the nation state and the national interests as a basic units to understanding any political decision in the war or peace. So this is the basic arguments. If we compare this kind of methodology with the early claim about the war, what's the main difference? What kind of the arguments has been excluded from these newly argued the viewpoints? That is, you find that in this new narration, some category in the 50s, 60s until the 80s were extremely important in understanding history. But now, as an ideology, were thought as an ideology, ideological bias were excluded. That's a category of the capitalism and the socialism, imperialism and internationalism. All these kind of categories were excluded from the narration of the war. So nothing. It's about the national history, national interests here and there, and interrelations between the nation states, between America and China, between Soviet and China, and also the Korea. So that's, I think that that was the newly developments. So in that sense, the Chinese academic achievements now, it's became more or less comparable, more compatible with the so-called international academia. Everywhere you find these kind of methodological nationalism, from my point of view, was really dominant methodology in understanding the social science research about the international relations. So this is the same. So more dialogues between Chinese sides and other sides. So I a little bit disturbed by this tendency because it's too easy to get rid of all the categories by claiming that it was only the ideology. So that was, let me try to understand what happened in the 1950s when, for example, China decided, especially the Mao Zedong, decided why he decided China's involvement in the Korean War. So the argument, it's everybody agreed that in 1950, in China, including Mao himself, nobody expected the war and China's involvement, because after the establishment of China, the top agenda for China was to recover the economy and the social order. And Mao in the 1950, before the war, he claimed that the top agenda for China was the land revolution and the land reform. So that was not the war at all. Industrialization followed that. So this is the very clear that the China didn't want any kind of the war outside of China. That was at the same time. Actually, the civil war in China until the 1950s has not ended yet, because the PLA, the Chinese army, was on the road to Tibet, to Xinjiang, to Southwest, and for the battles with KMT on the islands along the coast. So the civil war still continued at that time. So nobody really actually expected that China were involved in. However, at that time, Mao Zedong was isolated among his colleagues on the decision to send troops to Korea. Most of the leaders, of communist leaders, disagree with him to send troops to Korea. But eventually they were convinced by Mao, saying it's necessary for China to send troops to Korea. So why? He gave the reason. What kind of the reasons? He convinced his colleagues China in such a difficult timing should send the troops to Korea. He listed the 4 terms, very brief. He said that we send troops to Korea. It's necessary for China because defend China. Because the American army already approached the Yalu River and bombing some facilities along the river. That was the first. Second, he said that it's necessary to help North Korea. It's beneficiary to the North Korea. This is the very clear that in the after the war, and also the Cold War structure already emerged the East and the West. Certain kind of division were capitalist and the socialist camps were already there. So in that case, this is very easy to understand. However, he didn't just stop here. He said that actually the China involvement in the war will be helpful for the East and the world. So this is a term. Without the category that the imperialism or internationalism is difficult to understand the political decision there. If only for the national interests, it's not only. Obviously, that was basic. But the second part was very important too. What he referred, the East, what he referred, obviously, was the East Bloc, the socialist camps. He said that that war was very important for the East camp. Because after the 1945, the Cold War structure emerged. The containing policy of America here was quite clear. So that's why he said that this is the same. Last one, he said that it's also the whole world. What he, in his vocabulary, when he referred to the world, actually he referred to those oppressed nations, third world countries. Though at that time no terms for third world country for him. That was the term in the 1970s. But he actually tried to argue that national liberation movements worldwide will be encouraged for defeat America in Korea. So that's why the whole 4 terms for him. He talked about these terms. So in that case, we can think about that. If you only considered his intention to involve in the Korean War, only limited to the calculation of national interest, will not fully demonstrate the whole situation, why China involved at that time. This is the one from his perspective. The historian now argue that actually the war, they criticize that war. They argue that the war actually, because of the war, the confrontation between China and America obviously became intensified. At the same time, the process to be ally with the Soviet Union was intensified. That double process will contribute to the consolidation of the Cold War structure. So this is it was to some extent, it is right. So and also but on the other hand, the question is that how to evaluate the factors of Soviet Union in promoting China to involving the war. So this is another kind of the question. So obviously, without the Soviet support, it's very difficult for China to really engage the war in such scale. And also, China needed the weapons, air forces, and so on and so forth for the preparation for the war. However, I checked the whole archives and to see the schedules. We found that when Zhou Enlai was in Moscow in the negotiation with Stalin, and they sent the telegraph jointly to Mao to convince him that the Soviet Union will support China to do this and to do that. Mao was suspicious of that. He asked the Zhou Enlai to stay longer in Moscow to clarify whether or not that weapon and air force were ready. Obviously not. Molotov, foreign minister, later told Zhou Enlai that air force was not ready, and a lot of things was not ready. But before that, only when Mao sent the telegraph to Zhou Enlai, say that ask him to clarify what the conditions the Soviet Union promised to give China. He sent the telegraph, but next day or the next 2 days, he already decided to send the troops to Korea, which means that it's not simply because of the Soviet Union China decided to involve in the war. It was truly because of his own decision, rather than Stalin's decision for the Chinese involvement in the war. So that I think it's partly because based on the evaluation of the war situation in North Korea, in the whole Korea situation. So that is now the scholars, according to the American archive and both American archive and the Soviet archive, they argue that the America had no intention to invade China and cross the border and so on and so forth. And in the November of 1950, the France also raised the issue, asked the China withdraw its army from the Korea. However, whether or not the Chinese response is that why we don't ask all the foreign troops withdraw from the Korean Peninsula, which means that they thought that all these suggestions from the Western blocs were partial. So that was the situation with that. And according to his judgment, he thought that China will be threatened, especially the Northeast were on the threat of the American invasion. So that's the reason China involved the war so deeply. So this is the reason. Politically speaking, before the war, and in the January of the 1950, the Soviet actually suggested in the UN suggested to accept China's membership in UN, but it was rejected. And because of these reasons, Soviet Union rejected to went back to the UN seats. So that's why it's missed the opportunity to negate the suggestion to send troops that's the UN suggestion to Korea. So that's why the war was between the North Korea, China, and the 16 countries. And according to recently released, I read some papers and books from Japan that from October to December of 1950, actually Japan was also separate involved in the war. So which means that not only 16, but also 17 countries that on the one side and the two countries on the other side. So this is the basic situation. So in that sense, for that generation, the imperialism issue, internationalism issue was still the issue. Without that category was still very difficult to explain why they involved in such scale and made such decisions. Different elements, which means that we, on the one hand, we found the shortcomings of the old paradigm, but we shifted to the new paradigm. We limit ourselves. We thought from now current perspective, we don't understand why at that time different people inevitably involving such a war in that moment. So this is my second point. The Chinese, how to understand the Chinese war of the resisting America and helping Korea. That was the naming of the Mao. And that how, if we put that war into the history of the 20th century China in the first half century, especially the Communist war, what's the commonalities and what's the difference between the Korean War and the other wars in China? Obviously, the difference was very obvious. That war, all the wars, was happening in China before the Korean War. That was the first war for China to engage a war outside of China. Before that was the Red Army, or the war of resisting Japanese invasion, or the war of civil war in the late 40s. That all that war happened within China. But this was the only war at that time. The first war happened outside, sent troops outside of the China's border. So this is the first. Second, I think globally speaking, both for China and for the global situation, Korean War was the first war broke out under the condition of the nuclear power, nuclear threat. That was in the whole the history. That's the first war broke out under the condition of the nuclear power. So that the nuclear threat. So China, we know that the Professor Bruce Cummings gave a detailed description in his paper. So at least by the end of 1950, that the MacArthur suggested the use of the nuclear bomb. And also after the Eisenhower took the power, in 1953, there was series, according to the archive in the American side, they actually, the series conceded to use the nuclear bomb. They had made the plan for drop the 4 bombs, nuclear bombs. 2 will be in Korean Peninsula, 2 will be in northeast China. So that was a 2. That whole story happened here. So this is the very different from the early wars in modern Chinese history. This is the difference. And eventually the issue is that the nature of the war for Chinese army. What's the nature for Chinese army? Because Mao labeled his war in the earliest, before the Korean War, was People's War, right? The Red Army's war is a People's War. The war of resisting the Japanese invasion was People's War. But the question, I remember that many years ago, several years ago in Bologna, Bruce was there, the French political scientist, Lazarus, raised the issue that he claimed that the Chinese war in Korea was no more the People's War, because nothing to do with your own people, it's outside of. But certain kind of from my point of view, I give a definition of that war. On the one hand, was the continuation, certain kind of the continuation of that People's War. But on the other hand, was the end of the People's War. As the war itself as the end of the early version of the People's War. So what is the People's War in the early 20th century China? That was not a military conflict, a military struggle, but the certain kind of, in terms of so-called revolution. The land reform, social mobilization, united France, mass line, and so on and so forth. So in that case, the People's War was a political process, not only a military conflict. So it's a long political process. So that's a whole social mobilization. But obviously, when Chinese army came into Korean Peninsula, that was a totally different situation. Mao ordered that Chinese army should follow that principles. For example, respect the Korean people, respect King Chang and his leadership and the army and so on and so forth. But the general situation was different. However, one thing was still there. The Mao at that time was thinking that if China, together with North Korea, defeat America, that will be helpful for many third world countries for their self-determination. So that's why, in that sense, we can, on the one hand, there's a huge tragedy, so much casualties. Now it's the calculation emerged there, bigger than we expected, or the officially publicized. But on the other hand, another, for his perspective, well, at least we know that after the 1953, almost before its time is over. 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, I will finish that. So basically, his argument was that because American involvement in Vietnam War started from the 1953 too, in order to influence, threat China from south, in order to force China withdraw from Korea. So then the confrontation in Geneva Conference, the political process, and then the 1955, the Bandung Conference. Because the basic principle in the Bandung Conference, self-determination, and also then during the wartime, Mao argued that each nation will have the right to determine their own domestic affairs. Asian affairs should be decided by Asian people, which means that a certain kind of the elements of anti-imperialistic hegemonic power domination was there. So that was the limits. So obviously, all the situation gone. We are now in the totally different conditions. It's nobody. I think that the peace became the basic approach. That was true. But on the other hand, what kind of approach we can mobilize against the domination, different new powers domination in Korean Peninsula, East Asia, and the world? That was the question, and we learned from that history. Thank you.